Okay, hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the fifth part of our Digital Transformation Challenges mini-series. It is aimed, generally speaking, at leaders, but it's open for anybody from any kind of level within your schools and colleges. And we're kind of getting to the point where we're rounding off a lot of our discussion pieces we've had over the last few weeks. So if you have missed those sessions, we will make them available later on sort of via YouTube and share those out with everyone who has signed up, but also make them more widely available as well. So just a quick introduction from myself, and I'll bring the video up as well, so there's something to guide you in terms of what you're seeing and who you're seeing. So hi there, I'm Anthony Martin. I'm the Digital Innovations and Engagement Manager at Exeter College. And my role here is really around trying to drive change and digital technologies and tools, as well as pedagogy throughout Exeter College, and really looking at some of these key areas around digital transformation. Now, for us, obviously, there have been a number of challenges. We are progressing in our journey to digital, but as with many of you, there are sort of lots of challenges that we've faced, and I just wanted to talk through some of those, and that's what the series is really about, is talking through some of those key areas where we find a little bit of challenge in transformation. Today's session obviously is on communications, so hopefully you've made it to the right one. And as I say, if you haven't seen our previous sessions, do try and catch up on them, because they may give some great insights into kind of our journey and progress through this process. I'm also joined by Rachel today, who is sitting in the background, but will be looking out for any questions and answers that you may have. So do feel free to pop any questions into the chats window on the side, and we'll try and come to those towards the end of the session. And then also finally at the end of the session as well, as you're coming through the EdTech Demonstrator program, or at least hopefully that's how you found us, there is an opportunity to connect and engage with us if you'd like any extra support through that program. It's entirely free, but what we do ask, obviously, as part of that, and in order to unlock the funding for that, there is a very short survey just to give a bit of insight about your institution and what challenges you're facing. That is a really important part. So if you are sort of wanting to engage that, then please do make sure you fill that in for us at the end, and then we can be in touch with you. If you just want to attend our webinars, that's absolutely fine too. You don't need to engage in any further activity or training or anything else from us. You're more than welcome to just come along and attend our webinars. But if you do, if you could act on behalf of your institution, just pop a little note through, maybe on one of those forms, just to say that's what you'd like to do. That would be really helpful as well. Okay, so in these sessions, so far, we've been covering off, I'll just wait for my slide to catch up with me. There we go, right. So we've been covering innovation adoption, digital skills, time and resources. Fear and confidence was our session last week, and obviously today we're looking at communications. And then finally, we've got a roundup on taking it a step further with some AI, automation and standardization kind of aspects then in next week's session. Okay, so as we're here looking at effective communications today, it's worth me noting and saying at this point that this is not intended to be necessarily a leadership session on appropriateness of communications or everything about them. Is just really addressing the challenges around them, particularly in context of digital transformation. Okay, so I don't try and pit myself as a leadership advisor in those senses, and there are people who are probably much better placed than I to go through some of those fundamental elements with you. But in terms of change, in terms of digital, hopefully what I've got to sort of share with you today will be useful and insightful in some areas, and also just create some discussion and talking points for you going forward then. So I'd like to talk about 6 kind of key areas realistically. So comms barriers, overloaded comms, so being overloaded by the communications that we're receiving, the pace of change and how that influences communications, and then a really important piece then about understanding your own message and what it is you're trying to say, along with your strategy and approach to that. So how are you going to convey that information out to your teams? And then finally, a piece on feedback and making sure we use that in our in our strategies to actually make sure we're having a conversation with our teams, and that we're understanding how these changes that we're implementing are having an impact on the ground. So the first thing to take a look at then is around these communication barriers. I'm sure most of us have gone through that kind of initial training. Many of us as teachers would have also shared the kind of initial learning elements with many of our learners around functional skills and comms barriers and effective communications. So hopefully it's relatively deeply ingrained in most of us by now. But there's no harm in reminding ourselves of kind of what some of those barriers might be. And there are loads, but I'm just going to pick out a few. So here's some I picked out that I think are relevant in this particular context. So it's interpersonal skills, it's language and use of language, it's the physical barriers that we encounter, also then cultural and organizational barriers to communication. And from my point of view, this is then how they kind of break down, or some of the elements underneath that I think are again important in the digital context. And here we're looking, so if we start off with the interpersonal side of things, it's really around your personal approach, or those giving the message, writing the communications. What is their approach within it? You know, is it a friendly sort of aspect? Is it a professional aspect that's used? Use of language and those kind of things come into play as well. But the message itself, is it being delivered transparently? Is it being delivered in a trustworthy way? Do people buy into that? And again, in terms of those interpersonal skills, are we using things like active listening to understand how this is coming across and understands those key elements of our changes? Moving on then to language. So 3 key areas in focus here, really around formality, around tone, and around complexity. And we'll come on to some of those in a bit more detail later on. Physical, clearly this has quite easy to understand sort of concepts in here. So things like time, place, space. Are we doing putting our messages out, you know, at the appropriate time of day, in the appropriate place, or via the appropriate medium or form? Is it in the right kind of space? So if we're giving you maybe an announcement via lecture or via a team meeting, for instance, is there enough space around us and those kind of elements? But particularly, what about background noise? What about chatter? What about our workload? Is that going to have an impact on this as well? So the aspect of overload is really quite an important one, and that's one that I have got a whole section I'd like to talk through in a moment or two. And also tied with that as well, sorry, I should mention right at the end there is ability, but not to be missed on there. That's for a number of different aspects. Now, it could be in terms of physical ability to engage with that message. So whether it's something like hard of hearing, partially sighted, that influences maybe how that content is consumed by email, that might influence how we then deliver our communications via another channel, or do we make it available in multiple formats to ensure that we are being as inclusive as we can be when we're getting these messages out to our colleagues and teams? So from a cultural point of view, last week we looked at fear and confidence in particular, so it's worth bringing that back into here. The cultural elements of our communication strategy are really how we overcome those fears and how we use our comms to address those fears. But without that awareness, without that understanding, they can of course become barriers to our communications. And also on the cultural side, are we providing opportunities for feedback in here, or are we acting in a much more closed capacity? Is this very much a done deal or a mandated decision? Again, those kind of discussion points will be important for you in understanding kind of how best to get messages across. And from an organizational point of view, then this is also going to have some impact on the way we communicate. What is the reporting structure within your institution? Do these messages come out from the top? Do they come out from college or school leadership teams, for instance? Do they come out from heads of faculty departments? Is it a mix of all of the above? You know, how is that formalized? How does that reporting structure have some play on how we actually do this? And then finally, strategy, which is clearly a very important organizational element and will have a lot of bearing on then the effectiveness and how we communicate all together. So all of those factors, I think, are potentially barriers that stand in our way, and ones that we need to try and overcome where we can do. So communications overload. This one is something that I think rings true for all of us at the moment. We are all having to respond during lockdown and the global pandemic to a barrage of different messages, a barrage of mixed messages. And obviously many of us are trying to go through or trying to respond to that by transforming digitally, by moving all of our lessons kind of to a virtual platform. And of course, we have those messages around that change. We have the messages around our existing plans that we may have had in place on top of everything else that's going on as well. So there's very much a responsive element as well as a proactive element to some of what we're doing. And naturally, that's going to create lots and lots of resistance, perhaps, and pushback and concerns from our colleagues around, what is it that we're doing? What is our pathway? What's the aim, or what's the strategy, and is it the same as last week, or is it changed again? So there's a lot of that element coming into play here now. And under communications overload, there are kind of some further factors within here. We've got things like reliability of our messaging. For instance, are we getting accurate information? Is it reliable? Do we have to resort to different plans? Do we have to have something in place behind this? Can training help? So we covered some of that in our skills sessions and our fear sessions as well. But reliability is an important part of this. Can we rely on the message we're getting? Is it going to change soon? That could be something to consider. We also have this one of, and this is something I do hear quite a lot, is too much information. Both in terms of general comms, but also going out to the wider world, seeing what's going on within the press, within the news, looking at kind of things like the edtech space on Twitter. There's a lot of information out there, and it's really difficult sometimes to navigate that and to pull back the relevant information. So we talked previously around things like curating content and curating news items and articles and messaging that may be useful to share out. And clearly in this aspect, there's an element of that. There's too much to learn. There's too much information. Too little time is the other countering side to this as well, is even if we could understand all that information, we don't have time to necessarily consume it. And there may be an underlying lack of knowledge about the change element in particular. So it makes it appear more complex anyway. So that, as we talked about before, could be addressed by things like training, but it's still very much there and still something we need to be conscious of. Tying in with that, again, also tying in with this concept of barriers of communication is change fatigue. So it's a very real thing. I think there have been some studies on this now. It's in terms of how fast-paced things are going at the moment and how much we're trying to take on board at any one time and learn from. This idea of change fatigue comes into play where things are changing too fast. We can't keep up with it. It feels like an uphill battle. There may be perceived to be a lack of communication, or the countering side to that again is that actually there's just too much communication. We're sending out different announcements every day, and that in itself is a problem. So having too many announcements can be just as bad as having too few. And of course, whatever we're trying to drive behind this, the change and the transformation piece, what's the scale of that? Is that perceived to be too big? And I think my key message from here is, as we'll explore in the next few slides, is really around where people don't necessarily have an understanding of what the whole picture is, what the big picture is. Each of these little changes that we make and each of the communications we make around them will have a very different response than if we communicated out the full plan in the first place. So it can seem quite bitty. It can seem like it's opposing what we did last week sometimes. So I think it's really important to consider that when we do start looking at the strategy piece. And then finally within this area is this concept of becoming obsolete, and that is again a fear that drives some of the shutdown against communications. So I mention this as I think it's important when we do develop our strategies around comms that we look at some of those underlying human fears that we've talked about in our previous session, and that we use our comms as an opportunity to address them and to sort of target some of those and to reassure our colleagues as much as simply giving information. So this comes into play with things around, you know, job security aspects, about being left behind, when we talk about transformation, about perceived value as a team member from that, and of course the impact that all of this has on our discussions. Okay, so it's not one to shy away from. I think it is something we need to tackle head on. It is something that people feel, and we need to be attuned to those feelings and that, as I say, the human elements when we do start putting out our comms. So some of the things that we hear really regularly, and I'm sure we are not unique in this, and I'm sure this is something that you will find within your own institutions. There can be many opposing views actually as well here. So I'm certain that we're not the only ones. So we hear things like, is this optional? Does it apply to me? The message is too long, didn't read, a scrolling 2 pages worth of text can be off-putting. But how else do we communicate out those really important things that we need people to know, particularly with remote working and changes in policy, changes to things like safeguarding and considering those elements. How do we make sure we're giving enough info while not overloading people? Then the countering side obviously is not enough info. We might be providing just quick, short, sharp bulletins because we feel that's what we should be providing, and we're trying to answer the the commentary around having too much info. So we respond to that by giving less info. I don't think that's necessarily the right action. I think there are better things that we can do to address that, and I'm going to explore this with you in a minute. And then, of course, one size fits all doesn't always work with our comms. So which part is relevant to me? Do I need to know this as a teacher? Do I need to know this as a member of support staff, for instance? So that should have some bearing, and these are certainly things, like I say, that we hear. So let's start looking then at strategy, at your messaging, at what you're sending out. So let's start this off with, what are you trying to say? Fundamentally, this is something we need to understand with any kind of approach to comms, any new messages, whatever format they take. It comes down to this fundamental thing of, what is it we're trying to say? Now, there might be announcements around imminent changes and things we've just had to respond to, about changes in legislation, certainly around changes in the lockdown and what we're reacting to there. But on a broader sense, though, you're still trying to drive your digital transformation. So there is a communications piece happening, hopefully, in the background around that as well, or something you're looking to kickstart. So it's really important that you understand what your own strategy and what your own vision are for your transformation piece. So fundamentally here, what is your strategy? How much of it are you going to show? Is everything on show? Are there elements that are too detailed that perhaps don't need to be? What is the vision behind it? And what are your values? What is it you're trying to achieve? And I mention this because I think it's really important, again, looking back to that big picture element, that our colleagues understand what it is they're a part of. We talked about overload of information. We talked about quick fire messaging. We talked about those that perception that you're being overwhelmed by changeable messages. And in a complex digital transformation, that is entirely possible. So I think it's really important, if you can, to have communicated out your plan of action, to have shared the kind of roadmap of what it is you're trying to achieve and maybe timescales that go with it, as that will help address a lot of the questions, because you can signpost people back to that throughout your transformation, rather than having to keep issuing different announcements and different messaging. So I think that is a really important piece. Now, for us at the college, we've shared this a little bit. This is a rough visual conceptualization of some of the things that I've been working on our digital strategy, it does seem quite scary, and I think that's the point of it. You know, digital transformation in its entirety, if you look at every possible aspect of it, can seem quite daunting. What we've done here is taken kind of some of those key columns and pillars of the Microsoft Education Transformation Framework in this kind of transitional design that we've got at the moment, and I've put them effectively into a tube map so that we can see kind of how things interrelate and how they come together. Of course, if I share that message out, everyone's going to look at that and probably run for the hills, because blimey, that's complex and there's a lot going on. You know, how do we begin to even communicate that out? I should add that our current strategy is kind of in revision at the moment, in line with our college strategy and values, going through their kind of review periods. So there will be some different outcomes probably coming out of this in the future. But underpinning that, this is about understanding again our strategy, knowing what it is we're trying to achieve. Underpinning a lot of the stuff, and a lot of this has come from an IT perspective within the college, is the education transformation framework piece. So already you can see this looks a little tidier. It puts things into a bit of a clearer concept around the areas that we're trying to focus on. And I think that's important for you in your own journey and understanding how it breaks down, which teams and departments is it relevant to, and so on. Okay, now I thought it might be worth sharing with you just a little bit of insight. So for us, in terms of driving this change, we have a digital strategy group. So we have a steering group that has been tasked with really coming up with these ideas. What is it we're trying to drive towards, having key areas of focus? And this is just an initial outline of some of those elements. And I've highlighted out some of the kind of key things which have supported that that transition and that sort of starting block of change. So that's just sharing. We've actually kind of advanced this onwards and moving now to a digital implementation group where we're trying to implement a lot more of these things that we've talked about before. And that leads into, I think, then this strategy piece. So we've talked about tube lines, we've talked about train lines for our strategy. If you think about this idea of a golden thread, so for us, that golden thread runs through everything, and communications is a really important part of that. Okay, so I think communications should really be considered from the outset with your programs, and making sure that as part of anything, you're also thinking about how you're going to communicate these changes out as well. So we need a strategy. We need something to guide us. We need something to work from. And that kind of leads on to a few fundamental areas of our own sort of comms pieces and what you might design for yourself. So things around really considering clarity, making sure the message is going to be understood. Are we providing enough information? Are we arming our teams with all the facts they need? Completeness, again, think big picture. Have we joined up with all of the necessary teams? Have we got the complete picture of this? Do we understand what the impact is going to be with any of these elements? Conciseness, obviously we need to make sure it's to the point and it gets across quite quickly, and we want to convey that in the most efficient way we can do. For consideration, again, it's about things like inclusivity and making sure that we align this to feedback, that we align it to the feedback and the values and the discussions we're having with our colleagues as well. Correctness is obviously quite important. Let's avoid the guesswork. Let's you know, eliminate those unknowns if we can do. Let's make sure we're putting out factual information, not best intentioned kind of ideas necessarily, if we can do. And concreteness, this is a really important one because it ties back to that message around changing priorities and you know, overload and overwhelmed use of information. Is if we can be concrete about it, if we can cement it there and sort of show that it's not quite so subject to change, that there is a clear-cut pathway if we can, and then that's an important thing to try and incorporate. And then finally, courtesy, really making sure that if nothing else, we provide this information in a timely fashion. You know, have we given enough time for everyone to respond to this change? Are we communicating everything out that is necessary as part of that? And again, thinking about that process and making sure we factor these comms elements into our design and strategy at the outset. So I just want to share some of our kind of approaches that we've taken to this. So I don't just want to talk at you without showing some real world examples. So some of the things that we're doing to make sure this happens are really around announcement services. Those key messages, those important messages, obviously we have to link those out, but we can't put everything in one bulletin. I don't think we should put everything in one email, and it can be difficult to keep that consistent. So what we do is we link that then to internal intranet pages. The announcement is a headline, and the intranet page itself then takes on the responsibility of working out what is the appropriate level of information. So you can see on our pages here, we've got something around our flip week, part of our transformation. For us, what that would generally do is in the top half of the document is to give the overview and the insights of what's happening. And then on the bottom, we gradually increase the amount of detail as you scroll down the page. So for those who do need more detail, they know they can get to it. And by doing this and by sort of creating that process now, we're creating something that is a little bit easier for people to follow, and they understand the message that is being shared out then, and that it's going to be consistent kind of time after time. We also have fortnightly bulletins from our principal, contain updates on sort of other key pieces, including sometimes the digital. And also then hot topic or themed comms pages that take that feedback we've been listening to and address it as quickly as we can do with sort of updated articles or news guides. And again, back to that piece I said earlier on about curated content. So doing the research work, finding out what the clear-cut information is and providing that rather than just giving a link to the web or a link to, you know, the various websites that may contain this info. Moving on, then we're kind of looking then at more centralized news shared across the whole college. We already have a news section, but then rounding up much more from our departments and faculties that we have. Better clarity on our IT and development roadmaps are really important. So again, communicating those out as part of this is one of our following intentions. And of course, around the strategy relaunch and the vision and values changes, we'll be communicating that out as well, probably along similar lines, I should think. And just to quickly show through some of those, so this is a kind of examples of things we've done for remote working. So there's a page supporting this with all the resources that our teams could possibly need, tied with a handout and guide. So we're trying to address both the accessibility pieces with this, as well as the different formats, and trying to address those different ways that people consume info. Both should contain the same elements of it, I think, but it's just to highlight that we are trying to use different approaches. Also on our flip week, we've created pages for teacher guidance, and sort of there's another example of teacher guidance page that we've included there. And then from a learner point of view, it's important that we make sure we consider our comms with our learners as well. So here we've got video content that's been delivered by our principal, vice principal, assistant principals, and other members of the college as well. Choosing generally video format, but it might be that we send out newsletters, announcements, and those kind of things as well. So there's lots of channels, lots of different approaches you can take. Just consider them carefully in your strategy. I think there is a lot of value in video. You can say a lot with that. You can communicate really effectively with a talking head on screen, as we are today. So don't dismiss that in your approach to comms. And I think you could also follow up with a written document or a guide, and then that helps you also with the inclusivity aspect. Okay. Learner guidance, again, same thing. Reiterating that point, we provide information out on the learner guidance materials as well. And the kind of leading into the final couple of points I'd like to make on this really are around feedback. We talked about comms strategies, we talked about getting communications out there. We've obviously carried out lots of our own surveys with students. This is an example of kind of student devices and access to technology that we've taken on board. What I want to try and get across here is how you interpret that information then as part of your overall comms approach. We've obviously got things like our Net Promoter Score. This looks broadly positive, I think. Anything over 0 is good in this kind of setup. But what are we not seeing? And that's what I think is really important as well. When we do these surveys, when we get feedback from people, when we use them to guide how we're talking to the rest of our schools and colleges, how we're communicating out those changes, who are we not listening to? So here, yes, we're hearing the positives, we're hearing the negatives. Those are really important to bear in mind, and those are probably going to be your extreme views of one end or the other. But is your survey reflective of the entire student voice or staff voice in this context? Or actually, did you have a lot of non-responses? Because then if you've had a lot of non-responses and you react and you make changes according to one of those extreme views, you're probably going to be not alienating necessarily, but dismissing then the unheard or the silent majority views of those who didn't fill in the survey in the first place. So do just consider that when you're working with your kind of feedback and data that comes back out of that, is that it needs to be contextualized to give you an informed decision about how you should then approach the next steps. Joined up thinking, I just want to share back some of the things we talked about before, and it's worth looking back over other sessions if you found this one interesting. We talked about things like boosting confidence. We've also talked about approaches to change, and we've also talked about sources of fears, so overcoming fear and confidence issues. And those are just kind of some of the examples in previous sessions. They do all have very close ties to what we talk about in comms, and I think that's really important then to consider those and bear those in mind with our ongoing strategy. Okay, so I'm on to takeaways, which is the final stretch. So I think we're very close to time. Apologies if we have overrun a little bit. So takeaways really from me in sharing out what we've talked about today. These are kind of the key things that I think are really important. Are one, understanding your message. So understanding your message and understanding the underlying strategies behind that message. To be clear, to be concise and consistent in your communications. So do it, put the messages out at the same time every week via the same platform. In the same kind of format, so people can become used to them, and that can help you overcome those concepts of choppy messaging, of what seems like ad hoc or conflictory messages. Do consider that communications ought probably to be part of your design and conceptualization of any transformation piece. And then two-parter here, to be receptive to feedback. So thinking about other challenges we faced before, overcoming fears, to be receptive and take on board feedback that people have, but also to be ready with support when you get that feedback. So to have something in the background to maybe consider what fears people might have around what you're about to say. And then that ties in the final piece of consider the human need in this as well. How can you make sure that your messaging gets to those targets in the best possible way? And how can you deliver that in a way that maybe addresses some of those fears, maybe answers some of those questions from the outset? So again, it's using your feedback. And that is it for this particular session on comms. I hope that has been helpful for you. I'll just pop on screen now some details if you want to get in touch. The link there next to PID is the one that we're talking about or talked about right at the start of the session in terms of if you can please fill in one of those surveys for us if you want to sort of further engage with further support. And of course, I put my Twitter handle up there as well if you do want to get in touch and contact and look at some of the other things that we're doing. We tend to tweet out about some of those great initiatives that we're working on. I've been a bit quiet recently, but hopefully we'll pick that back up. And so finally, thank you all very much for coming along. I will put it out to questions and answers. So if we do have anything else coming up now, then please do feel free to pop it into the questions. And we'll try and answer those. Otherwise, thanks again for coming along, and see you in the next session.